Trump has been saying that the U.S. will hit very fast and very hard, referring to 52 so-called cultural sites in Iran. Has he given more meat to this? Has he expanded on this threat?
Well, the latest here from Washington is a picture of deep political chaos at the heart of the U.S. administration, at the heart of President Trump's White House. Officials inside the White House, the military, and also members of President Trump's relatively inexperienced national security team really scrambling to deal with the crisis. Republican supporters of President Trump insisting that the threats posed by Iran's former top general, who was taken out by the U.S., he posed an imminent threat to Americans. President Trump insisting still that he has protected and saved American lives, but still the White House is refusing to elaborate on what those imminent threats might have been. We're getting some word from the White House that they may declassify information. Democrats really outraged and shocked and expressing a great deal of consternation about the president's actions. Meanwhile, the White House claiming victory over the previous administration, the Obama administration, slamming the Obama administration for its apparent inaction. That accusation coming from U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo earlier this morning, accusing Iran of undermining peace efforts in Afghanistan. But still, we have very scant detail of evidence of what those imminent threats were, and definitely some confusion from the White House over this question of targeting cultural sites, and confusion from the military over whether or not they intend to pull out of Iraq following a vote in the Iraqi parliament to eject U.S. troops there. But America very much in the defensive position, crouching position, now bracing for any possible reprisal attacks with Iran, indicating that it is preparing and could attack with medium to long range missiles and would attack the some 27 U.S. bases closest to Iran. So that's the situation here from Washington.
So, Nina, in all of that war talk, I'd imagine that the U.S. is feeling very comfortably in the higher position, having spent something like $933.6 billion US dollars on its military equipment in the past year, and in comparison, I think Iran something like 18.9 billion rand. So it's obviously got a greater military might. But just in terms of boots on the ground, active members, the US government is suggesting that there could be something like more than 500,000 members of Iranian armed forces, with over 1 million potential reservists. So is that of concern?
Well, certainly that is the picture that the White House is presenting, with real questions here in Washington as to whether or not that's a true representation. I mean, certainly evidence appears to be emerging that Iran is moving or making military maneuvers as we speak, which is, I think, what has put Washington on the defensive. But having, taken decisive action, I think the question here for analysts in Washington is what is at the heart of the U.S. president's decision-making. Top officials have really, as I say, been left scrambling to explain the president's strategy. The Pentagon was seriously embarrassed on Monday, first coming out and saying that it was withdrawing U.S. troops, and then having to admit that statement was a mistake, that it had no plans to withdraw despite Iraq's positioning. So, we're seeing an upping of the ante. Democrats furious. Nancy Pelosi, who's a House Speaker, trying to put a stop to the president's process by introducing legislation that would have him stop any kind of military action, or at least limit the scope of it. But Republicans insisting that Democrats are somehow disloyal and for not getting behind the president.
And just some of the reports indicating that Iran itself has some of the most diverse military arsenal. Its ballistic missiles and cruise missiles alone are enough of a threat. Is that enough to galvanize some Republicans to perhaps change tack and support the Democrats on this bid for legislation to prevent the president from taking such action in future?
There is some degree of caution, you're right, on the Republican side. We've heard from Senator Rand Paul throwing cold water on the theory that Soleimani presented an imminent threat. But I think the real question for President Trump as he moves forward with his strategy, his short-term and long-term strategy on Iran, is what his base makes of his decision-making. We're heading, as you know, into the all-important Iowa caucuses on at the beginning of February, and then rapidly soon after into New Hampshire and Super Tuesday as the primaries get underway. This is an election year for President Trump, and meanwhile he's got a crisis on Capitol Hill with the row over his impeachment deepening. So he's really now mainly through his own doing, facing two very large international but also domestic crises with the impeachment proceedings, and now this question over whether or not Washington is positioning itself to go to war with Iran. So I think a lot will depend on what polls tell him about whether or not his base and his supporters are behind him, because ultimately that is what is going to drive Republican support or criticism of him on the Hill.
Thank you very much, Nina. SABC News correspondent in D.C., Nina Maria Ponce. And now let's remind you of what the headlines are here back home.
2019 results, 81.3%.
That's the Basic Education Minister announcing the highest matric pass rate since the dawn of democracy. Independent schools pass rate dropping, but still remains impressive. Tragic scenes from Iran as a stampede leaves more than 50 dead at a military commander Soleimani's burial. And that's how we come to the end of the Tuesday edition of The Full View. Please do stay with us and enjoy the rest of the viewing here on Channel 404.